In this Halloween themed change up from the normal content you guys are used to seeing on my channel, I want to show you guys how I made this trophy for my work for the winner of our pumpkin carving contest. In this video I'm going to show you some basic 3D modeling, how to fill a print with plaster to make it feel heavy and real, and then how I painted it and glued it all together. Thanks for clicking on this video, I hope you enjoy it. The first thing I did was start searching the internet for a file that I could use. There was not any pre-made jack-o'-lantern trophy type files, so I decided I wanted to try to make one. I searched for a great classic jack-o'-lantern and found this one on Thingiverse. The actual files that I make in this video I've posted on Thingiverse as a remix to that original classic jack-o'-lantern. The link will be in the description so you guys can download it for yourselves to make your own pumpkin carving trophy, or to use the trophy base that I modeled and combine it with another STL to make a completely different trophy of your own. Now, I know almost nothing about 3D modeling, but I do know how to drag and drop. And if you know how to drag and drop, you can definitely use TinkerCad to make some of your own simple 3D models. I want to show you guys a little bit how I made this trophy base. With TinkerCad, you can drag shapes into the working plane. And I know I wanted the base to be about 5 inches by 5 inches, so I just simply typed in the millimeter equivalent to that. Or you can also switch to inches in the bottom right. Then I can use the arrow to make it taller to where I feel like it should be. Then to get that nice detailed edge on the top and the bottom, I'm simply using a pyramid. If you select both objects, you can click Align to make sure they're perfectly centered. Then I was able to adjust the scaling for the pyramid how I needed, and eventually add another one for the top and flip it 180 degrees to create that top detail. I realized it would be sticking out of the bottom, so I duplicated my cube and switched it from solid to hole. Then when you select both the solid and the hole and merge them together, it cuts the hole out of the other object. For the actual nameplate on the front, I just grabbed another rectangle and set it up in the front and scaled it to something that I thought would look nice. Originally I had it sticking out from the main square trophy piece, but I would eventually use a second hole to turn it into a nice rim detail and actually separate it completely and make it its own separate model. This way I could print it on its back completely separate to try to avoid layer lines, and then just glue it in later. I knew that I wanted to find a way to give this thing some weight so that it actually felt like a nice little statue or trophy and didn't feel like some cheap 3D print. What I settled on was filling the inside with plaster of Paris. To make putting the plaster inside of the model easier on myself, I ended up turning the entire trophy into sort of a container with its own lid. That way, I could fill the entire thing with plaster and then glue the two pieces together. To do this, I simply added another cube, turned it into a hole, and then grouped it with my lower base piece. Then I duplicated my base trophy piece so that I could turn one of them into a hole and merge that hole with the lid. This would create a nice perfect cutout that the lid could fit into. I wanted to create a little insert for a tea light so that you could turn on a little LED inside of the pumpkin. For that, I first added a cylinder so the pumpkin would sit on a nice round part of the trophy base. Then I simply created a second cylinder matching the dimensions of a tea light I found on Amazon, turned it into a hole, and merged it with that lid piece. This is what it was looking like when it was all put together. You can see me here rotating my nameplate down, and I wanted to separate that whole cylinder so that I could eventually punch that hole through our little pumpkin model as well. The pumpkin model was too complicated to import into TinkerCad, so to cut out my little tea light hole through the bottom of it, I brought it into Mesh Mixer. I lined that up with my trophy base lid, then made that lid invisible, and used Boolean difference to cut the cylinder out of the pumpkin. I would bring these files in and out of Cura a little bit just to check the scale, and I did go back into TinkerCad to adjust the size of that little base a couple of times. Eventually I had it where I liked it. If you use the link in the description to download the files that I've provided, you can go into TinkerCad and import the little nameplate piece that I have. Then all you have to do is simply drag the text on there, type what you want, change the font to what you want, and scale it. Then just double check your height so that it's not too tall. And you can merge it if you want. Then all you've got to do is export as an STL, and you have your own custom nameplate that fits perfectly in our trophy base. I'm going to briefly show you here how I set these up to print. They're pretty simple, not a lot to it. I felt like a couple of them needed supports, but you maybe could have printed them without supports. The pumpkin was the main thing. I wanted to be really careful and set up some custom supports to make sure that those teeth didn't have any issues. Once I had it all formatted to actually print, it looked something like this. After all of these pieces were printed, I was able to take them and remove all those supports. The supports for the trophy base came off super simple. I had to be extremely careful on the pumpkin to make sure that when I was clipping those supports out, I didn't accidentally clip any of the teeth. The points of those upper teeth were sitting on those supports, and those teeth really wanted to get broken off. Take your time with this. It'd be a bummer to accidentally snap one of those off and have to reprint it or reprint the whole thing. After removing all the supports, I gave all those pieces my normal power sanding. I also used a file on the pumpkin to be able to get into those eye, nose, and mouth details. Then I took them to the sink to rinse all that sanding dust off, and then slightly hit it with some wet sanding. After that, I was ready to fill the main base piece with plaster. For this, I'm using Plaster of Paris that I got on Amazon. I got a 5-pound bag, but there is smaller bags you can buy. Mixing this is actually pretty simple. You simply do 3 parts water to 4 parts plaster, mix it up, and then start to pour it in. I wanted to use a container that I didn't care about messing up, so I used an old jelly container. But because of the narrow top, this ended up being really difficult. I recommend a more open container. Eventually I got it all mixed and I was able to start pouring it in. I do think I did too much water because it did take longer than 30 minutes for it to dry. In fact, I ended up letting it sit for like 24 hours just to make sure I was good. This was actually my first time dealing with plaster Paris, and I'm pretty happy with the results. The trophy has a nice hefty weight to it. It does not feel like just a little cheap plastic 3D printed part. When I brought this trophy into work, everyone was very impressed. After that, I was ready for glue. For this project, I'm using my classic combination of a high-strength, slow-drying glue and a relatively high-strength, really fast-drying glue. For that, I'm using E6000 and CA glue. Now, I wasn't 100% confident that my middle area that came down of the lid piece was actually going to be able to touch that plaster. So I did fill it with a lot of glue just in case, but I wanted to make sure that the entire edge had plenty of glue on it, just in case that was the only area holding it down. Once I had it pushed down, I also added some extra glue along the seams. I did this for 2 reasons. First off, to make sure that I did have enough glue and that I could help get some extra glue in those seams. And I also did it to help close that gap a little bit. For this, I was applying a little bit of a thicker glob of glue, spreading it and smoothing it a little bit with a paper towel, and then clamping down on it and spraying it with the CA activator. Once the lid was all glued down and good to go, I also decided to glue down that nameplate at this stage as well. Once this thing's glued together, it's looking pretty solid and it's feeling very solid. I had a pretty fast turnaround to get this thing completed, so I knew that for smoothing, my first step should be some UV resin. I'm simply going to pour some in a cup, take an old brush, and carefully brush that resin over the surface of the entire piece. I'll use a UV flashlight to cure it as I go. This is a very easy way to smooth a piece fast. I ended up doing a couple layers to make sure it was nice and thick. I am using transparent resin, so I don't feel like there's an issue with the UV light curing all the layers. After that initial cure with the UV flashlight, you can either set it outside to get some sun, or if you have a cure station, you can always put it in that. After it's totally cured, you're going to see that the piece is still a little bit tacky, even though it is cured. A wet sand will not only fix that tackiness, but also smooth that surface out. Right here I'm using 600 grit. Once it's all dried, I take it outside and add some filler primer. I'm using the Rust-Oleum 2-in-1, but there are other options. I spray both the pumpkin and the base, making sure I get good coverage, and once it was dry, it was looking pretty good. This filler primer is really going to help us smooth that surface and fill those sandpaper lines. You can see here at the sink how nice these pieces look, even after just doing a layer of UV resin and a layer of filler primer. I then wet sanded that filler primer, and after that I already felt like the pieces were ready to paint. For the base, I'm simply using a black spray paint. I'm using the flat black Rust-Oleum 2X. I usually like to start with the bottom side. For the main pumpkin part, I'm simply using an orange spray paint that I had sitting around. After that one side had plenty of time to dry, I flipped each piece over and hit the same paint on the other side. I made sure my coverage was good, because this would be my last base layer. With just our base paint down, our piece was already looking pretty good. To make those details pop on the trophy base, I decided to go with silver rub and buff. Usually for a trophy like this, I would choose a different color of rub and buff, but for Halloween, the silver just felt perfect. I'm simply going to squeeze some out, then use my finger to get a little bit on there, and rub it all along those high spots on this trophy. I started with just the nameplate in the front and decided I wanted to go over the whole thing. I hit all the corners and edges. There's really nothing too fancy to this. I'm just trying to give this thing some highlights and make a little bit of it pop. For the stem of the pumpkin lid, I was going to tape it off and spray paint it, but I decided just to mix some random browns and greens together and do a few different layers, brushing it on and slightly adjusting the mix of those 3 colors with each layer to give it some color variety. The acrylic paint usually takes a few layers to get good coverage anyway. I also decided to use some black acrylic paint to try to get it into some of the grooves on the pumpkin to make some of those details pop. This would definitely look a lot better with an airbrush, but I don't have one of those yet. I went around the pumpkin adding that black kind of deep and then wiping it out with a t-shirt or a q-tip to pull it back a little bit. Since it is Halloween, I was okay if it looked a bit dirty and grungy. I then take an old t-shirt and buff that rub and buff that I had applied to the base before. I want to make sure it's all buffed in and smooth. I felt like some of the details on the nameplate got a little bit washed out, so I'm using a very fine brush with some more of that black acrylic, and I'm adding some of that deep black into some of the lettering details and anything where the rub and buff may have smudged on. I know I have some of it blurred on the screen. That's just to protect my organization, but hopefully you can see that it really did add some contrast to those letters and really make them pop. I decided that the base was looking a little bit plain, so I took some silver acrylic paint and very carefully dry brushed it along some of the other edges and even flat areas. I mixed a tiny bit of brown, the silver, and some of that black I used before, and did really long strokes along the side to try to make the sides of it almost look like black stained wood or something. My normal projects, I'm trying to copy an accurate movie prop, but for this I was able just to mess around and see what I thought would look good, since I wasn't mimicking something else. I do add a little bit more shadow and highlight detail to that stem piece up on the lid, and after all that paint was dry, I felt like it was ready to glue together. For this, I am using my same mixture of E6000 and CA glue. The E6000 is super strong and the CA glue sets fast. You could always replace the CA glue with super glue or Gorilla Glue or something like that. I believe I did the E6000 on the bottom of the pumpkin and then the CA glue on the top of the base, just so I wasn't mixing glues as I spread it. And then I had the very important job of making sure it was all lined up correctly. So I was looking down the top of the pumpkin and making sure that my hole lined up that I cut in for that little LED tea light. I hold it in place real good for just a couple of minutes, and I use a paper towel to try to get into that gap and wipe out any glue that kind of oozed out the sides. I ended up setting something heavy on top just to make sure it stayed in place overnight as it dried, and then it was pretty much done.
That is going to conclude this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As usual, links to everything I used are going to be down in the description. If you learned something from this video, please leave me a comment down below. I do read all of them. Hit that subscribe button if you liked it, and I'll see you guys in the next video.